Hi all. Today we are going to do a production walkthrough of my new single, Run. Together we're going to go through the Ableton session and I'm going to walk you through some of the most critical elements of this song. We're going to talk about drum sequencing, drum processing, vocal processing, guitar chops, string quartet, custom instruments, and a number of additional things as well. As always, I'm going to have timestamps in the description below, so feel free to jump around the chapters that are most interesting to you, and they'll be there for quick revisiting if you try any of these techniques in your own productions later. I'm going to start off by playing the final chorus for you so you can get a sense of what's happening in this track. And feel free, if you'd like to pause the video, I have the music video linked in the description below. You can also go listen to the whole track before we dive in. So without further ado, I'll see you on the other side. Okay, let's start off by talking about the custom instruments that I made that I'm using in this production. Oftentimes with my students, I have conversations with them about how to find your own sound as an artist. And often those conversations are quite conceptual in nature, frankly. But I think that one very practical answer to that question is to create your own sounds, to create your own instruments. And so in the case of the pad that really dominates the track, as well as the piano that comes in halfway through, both of these are instruments that I made myself. So this first one, I kind of call it the late summer pad. I took a recording of a cicada that I recorded when I was back home visiting family this summer, and I used EQ to draw a single resonance out of it, much in the same way that I did with the water in my previous video, which I will link in the description if you want to see that in action. But for now, I'm just going to show you the sample. So this is a sample that I use as foundation for this instrument. And then from there, I built a sampler instrument with a whole bunch of audio effect racks nested into audio effect racks to create this instrument here. And I love it. It's really an excellent sounding instrument. Let me solo it. It really kind of has its moment in the sun, so to speak, I guess no pun intended, with this break section here. It's just a really dark, rich tone. And so I've got a number of controls built in for stereo width. Sun, smoke, humidity are all variations of different effects. One is a grain delay, the other is a reverb, and the other is an instance of erosion, as well as one of them also has the FM oscillator. I won't dive too crazy deep into this, but if you are interested in me doing a walkthrough of one of my more robustly designed instruments like this one, I would happily make one. The other instrument that I am using that is custom made is Brad and Lynn's piano, named after my in-laws. They have this piano, this old grand piano in their home that I describe as really lovingly out of tune. There is maybe like an octave and a half range that is remotely usable, but one time when I was home visiting them and the rest of my family, I took the time to record all of those usable notes and then created a relatively robustly multi-sampled instrument out of it. And then similarly to that cicada pad, I created a number of audio effect racks that are nestled in here as well. And I love this piano. It's very mournful and pensive and contemplative, which worked really nicely with this song. And so when the piano enters, it is playing the melody that I sang at the beginning and harmonizing it, as well as then doing some simple arpeggios of the chords. So let me play that on its own so you can hear that as well. And for the transition here into the final chorus, it just jumps up an octave, and I increase the stereo width, as well as I use what I'm calling the brightness function, but is essentially I'm just using the pitch oscillator, the FM oscillator within sampler, to draw out frequencies in the upper register of the frequency spectrum to essentially mimic brightness on it, right? So I'll play that transition so you can kind of hear it. So kind of shows off some of the range of this instrument. But I think that both of these are kind of indelible to the character of this track. The pad just carries through pretty much the whole way. And then the piano is what really lifts it in the back half. After I recorded the guitar and vocal demo, the drums were really the first part of the final production that I put together, and that kind of helped give a sense of shape and feel. So the drums are divided into two groupings here, right? The kick stands alone, and then everything else is grouped together into a group. And I'm doing that because I wanted the kick to remain clean the entire time. But the rest of the drums, I slowly add delay and distortion, and there are sections where I do a little filtering. So if we solo both groupings, this is the drums when they first appear. And then when we get towards the tail end of the section, like the final chorus, we've got distortion and delay added onto the snare, the hi-hat, and the additional percussion. And so now that sounds like this. So if we pull away the kick, we can really kind of hear that added grit and delay on everything else sitting atop of it. And so I wanted the kick to remain clean for really one primary reason, is that I wanted there to be as much clarity as possible surrounding the kick's relationship with the sub bass, which is right above it here. It's honestly one of my favorite parts of this entire production, and I think that it's one of the aspects that makes the groove interesting to me. So I am essentially, in a way, creating a call and response between the kick and the sub. They never play together. The sub always comes in when the kick is silent, and vice versa. And it creates this really kind of interesting push-pull effect. So let me play the kick on its own so we can hear that. And it pretty much keeps that pattern up the whole time, right? And then here's what the sub is playing. Right, and so when you put both of them together, then you can really kind of hear that push-pull relationship. And I just find that really compelling. And I found that when I distorted the kick, because I did try originally to have the kick grouped in with the drums like that, it just so overpowered what the sub was doing, and I didn't want to distort the sub as well. So it felt better to me and cleaner from just a mix perspective, as well as like a mix legibility perspective to leave the kick clean. Another aspect of the drums that I think is worth pointing out, there's a couple, is the snare. So I'm just using a sample from my library, but I am running a delay on it that is set, to only 23% wet, a pretty high feedback at 78%. And then I'm running it in time mode. And specifically, what's I think makes it sound compelling is that I am automating the time so that we really hear that motion on the snare, and it creates an almost, it's like halfway between a flanger and like a pseudo kind of comb filter sound. And then sometimes I will, in addition to playing with the delay time, I will sometimes crank up the wet dry to create an interesting effect. So let me play that on its own so you can kind of hear that. I think it's a really, frankly, great way to get like a lot of mileage out of a single snare sample that really isn't having much variety as far as volume or pitch. I really didn't change any of the subtleties on any of these instances of this snare. I'm really just letting this delay effect kind of drive the ship. And of course, we've got the delay and the distortion that's on the bus here that is also, creating what essentially feels like ghost notes. But the effect is still compelling if we go, back to pretty much the beginning where we don't have either of those effects present. Yeah, I think it's really great, right? And this pattern that I have pairs really nicely with the kick as well. And then the other aspect of the drums that I think is worth pointing out is the guitar I recorded here. I'm not going to go grab it. It's on my back shelf. But it is a small piece of hand percussion. And I recorded it here. Let me see if we have the original. Yeah, there we go. So that's what it sounded like by default. I did a bit of processing on it. I warped the sample a little bit as far as using the Beats warp mode here. I set it to a 16th note rate and then tightened up the envelope. If you didn't know this, you can set the envelope on the warp mode to not loop, and then just tighten up the size of it. You can use this to essentially create like rhythmic, stuttery loops out of almost any sound. But you can also use it to clean up percussion recordings, which is something that I do relatively often. As well as then I have it pitched down to octaves. So if we pull off the effects that I have here and solo just this, we can hear that. All right, so it sounds almost more like a wood knock or something like that, right? Then in addition to that, then I'm running it into an instance of shifter that is altering the coarse frequency to 800 hertz, as well as then adding some spread to get some width. We're using the tone function on shifter to darken the sound. It's not quite a low pass filter. You can almost think of it more like a shelf. So this is really darkening some of that top end and running it pretty much 100% wet. And so it's just the shifter. It sounds like this. So funny, it feels like it's been pitch shifted back up, which it has, right? And then from there, I am running an instance of pedal set to the fuzz mode. I am absolutely diming the mids and just cutting out the treble and the bass. And the wet dry is set to roughly 50-50 at 46% wet and 71% gain. So I'm hitting it really hard with fuzz. And it's great because the this Beats warp mode settings that I have, like I said, in the space between, it's not completely silent, and so it's creating this stutter that likely wouldn't be audible without the heavy distortion. Yeah, so it's there in the recording, but it's so quiet, and we can't really hear it until this insane amount of distortion is pulling it forward, creating this really subtle layer. And then just the last bit with the drums that I think is worth mentioning is the hi-hat. So I am using just a closed 808 hi-hat, and it's just doing a constant stream of 16th notes. There are a couple of details with these hi-hats that I think matters. Details that I kind of want to point out because with a lot of my production students, they're missed details. So if we solo just the hi-hats here and give them a listen. Right, they have a bit of a bounce to them for a couple of reasons. One, I am swinging them by using the groove pool. It's hard to really visualize what's happening because I'm not committing the groove to the clip. But let me do that really quickly so that we can see. So I'll commit the groove by hitting the commit groove button. And now we'll notice that the first and the third hi-hat in every quarter note grouping, right? 4/16 notes equals a quarter note, is now slightly longer than the second and the fourth. That is the definition of swing, right? By the way, this is something that I don't think as many people know. So if you go into the groove pool here in Ableton and we go down to where there's swing, you'll notice that the swing is set, roughly 52 is usually the lowest number that you'll hear, all the way up to in the 70s, right? And so like, what does that mean, right? If we say, 73% swing, right? Well, we need to think about in terms of two note groupings. So the swing that I'm using is a 16th note swing, and it is the 59 swing, right? So what that means then, two 16th notes create an 8th note, right? And so then in every 2 16th note pair, the first 16th note takes up 59% of the available space, and the second 16th note takes up only 41%, right? And so if you were ever kind of confused about those numbers, that is what is happening, right? And it's swing in music production is really heavily related to swing as the concept exists in jazz, but there's a bit more I guess precise granularity, you could say, with swing with regards to music production, right? In jazz, we usually think of swing. Well, okay, so a way that it's commonly described, though it's not like exactly it, is that if you had a triplet grouping and you had a tie between the first eighth note and the second eighth note in the triplet, and then played the third eighth note in the triplet, so da 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 instead of da 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 da. It's a good way to conceptualize it, though that isn't like necessarily exactly how that time feel works. I digress though, right? But what I really like about this is the hi-hats are actually the only element that's being swung out of all of the drums. And I think that push and pull is really interesting between everything else being straight and then this hi-hat being swung. And in addition, the hi-hat, I'm using velocity here to add emphasis to the ands, right? The offbeats pretty much. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? If I play the hi-hat on its own, you can hear that accent. That's what gives it its sense of lift and its sense of bounce. So in addition to the flow that really comes with swinging it, it's that lift on the ands that gives it that sense of groove. And for me, it's really compelling the way that the kick and the snare and this hand percussion that I sound design is pushing and pulling against that. So like a straight feel against a swung feel. I was really inspired to do that because I recently read a biography on the producer Jay Dilla, who like a lot of this kind of machine time feel stuff that is really quite common, he pioneered, right? So this is the drums all together, and specifically I think it's worth listening to the relationship between the hi-hats and everything else. There's a little bit of tension, right? Especially if we were to solo the death gyro that has the space in the straight kind of 16th note groove happening here in the middle, right? So that's straight, but at a 16th note, and then this is swung. And so those together, there's a bit of tension. I think that's great. The song is very tense, frankly. And so that's really what's happening with the drums. I'm keeping them pretty simple. There are a couple of reversed crash cymbals that I'm just pitch shifting down a perfect fifth, warping with the texture mode, and reversing to use as risers. So before the vocals come in, this crash drops in. Let me solo the kick and the rest of the drums here so we can kind of hear that. But that's the drums. Okay, so let's talk about the string quartet that is in this production. It comes in the final chorus, and then really is, for me, the dominant texture of the remainder of the track. We do hear hints of it at the beginning. All the way at the beginning, this, high, elusive, synthy sounding element is actually violin harmonics. And if you're curious about what library I am using, I have the Cinematic Studio solo strings that I use for all of my string sounds. For any orchestral stuff that I do, which isn't really a ton, I use Cinematic Studio. It's one of the few instances where I'm stepping outside of stock Ableton, honestly. And then in addition, I am processing it through Impact Soundworks Tape Sculptor, which is a really neat plugin. It has, filters, compressors, saturation, all of the necessary tools and components to really get that kind of degraded tape feel. I actually have this plugin running on every instrument in the quartet, actually. And so the quartet comes in the final chorus. I added it because I had just the piano at first, and the piano was really the first introduction of elements that were, acoustic in nature. The whole track is very electronic, heavily processed, and then this very acoustic feeling piano comes in, and it somewhat stuck out like a sore thumb. And I had already then had these whispery harmonics, and so a friend suggested, when I sent them, a rough version of this, to add strings. And I was like, fuck, a string quartet, okay. But they were right. So here's what it's playing at the final chorus, and then I'll break down some of the parts. So this chorus was already quite dense, right? Let me play a little bit of this final chorus for you. And even actually, I'll mute the strings and you're going to hear the fullness of it, frankly. Right, so we've got the guitars come back in after not being present anywhere. The drums are distorted now. We've got the piano, we have the pad, and then we have my robust and wailing vocals in there, right? So to fit the string quartet in, I kind of had to be smart about how I was arranging it. And so, but I still wanted them to kind of stand out. I wanted the quartet to be an interesting addition and to really add to the sense of meandering lostness that I want this track to have, frankly. So the two violins are playing completely original lines that don't really appear anywhere else in the production. They're sitting really kind of in the top of their range, particularly violin 1. But they're not playing particularly rhythmic or fast. So they're really there to kind of add motion, and I'm using a lot of slides to, once again, try to have this reaching quality to it. So let me play those so you can kind of hear what's happening there. Particularly in that measure that I just played, you can kind of hear the violin 1 slides up, and then a beat later, violin 2 slides up to chase it, and they're kind of in this this pseudo call and response. Well, let me play it a little bit earlier. There we go. Right. Violin 1 the viola and the cello, they're kind of doubling. The viola is doubling the arpeggios that are in the piano part. So that's one spot where I'm not adding anything new. The viola pretty much is squarely in the mid-range, and it was going to be a lot harder to make any sort of new element jump out there. The cello is complementing different elements and outlining the harmony. So let me play the cello part on its own. And to really understand the cello's role in everything, we need to bring the kick and the sub in. I mentioned that the kick and the sub are two elements whose relationship to one another is one of the defining qualities of this production for me. And when you add in the cello, then it's just, I love this. And if we were to throw in the viola, then we really we have the foundations of the groove present here. And then let's pull in everything for context. Right, and so it has that motion, has that propulsion, and also has that wandering feel to it, which is what I wanted from the quartet. The quartet continues when the track moves into what I'm calling the B section, which is pretty much just when I am singing something entirely new. And because I am singing something completely new, I am doing a couple of things with the strings. First, I am bringing down the volume of the strings and the intensity at which they're being played. Let me play just from the tail end of this final chorus into the B section with just a string quartet, so you can hear that change. And then we'll pause here before we get to what's happening in pretty much the outro there. Right, so I am doing, a number of things. I am, both bringing down velocity, right? If we look here in the viola, this section is a bit quieter than this section velocity wise, right? And with short strings, right, they're playing in a very staccato manner. Velocity is really going to cover that with programming. With these with the two violins, right, it's a bit of a different beast there, right? I'm doing a lot of modulating the mod wheel and then breath control to control volume and dynamics across the board with these, and that's just both of them. And both of those things are really important for expressiveness, right? That thinking also about how I mentioned swing and velocity as it pertains to the drums, right? These are all things that are important for expressiveness, automation of effects as well. And with my students, often what I see is opportunities for expressiveness in their music that has been left on the table. So some of these things might seem simple, and why am I devoting the time to talking about them in this YouTube production breakdown? But I'm talking about them because they're the most critical details, right? And so then when we get to the second half of the B section here, I'm going to pull in this violin harmonics. Everyone in the quartet switches to playing harmonics, and I add a bunch of gain because harmonics are really quiet, especially artificial harmonics on string instruments. And so you have these what should be quiet harmonics that are ultimately pretty loud, that are then fed into each of them their own instance of tape sculptor, and it just creates this really I don't want to say fuzzed out, but kind of fuzzy old sound. I might think of better words to describe it, but I think it's best to just play it for everybody. And then I use instances of utility on each of them to just make hard cuts, because I didn't want any of them trailing over into this outro. And so, yeah, I mean, that's really the string quartet. It kind of was originally like the headache that I needed to add into the production because I needed it, and then ultimately became one of, if not maybe my favorite part of this entire track. Okay, so I want to talk about the guitar chops that come in about halfway through the intro. So if I solo them, they are this. Cool. And so these chops, there's two sets, one made from an F major chord, another made from an A minor chord. Both of those chords come from the original recording that I made when I was demoing this idea. If we look in browser. Yeah, so the original sound was very much like an Andy Summers kind of chorusy style guitar part. But I felt like that didn't fit with the original vibe. So I did a couple of things to it. So first, I chopped it up as we just heard. And then loaded it into Ableton's simpler device. And using the slice mode, I laid out a number of different slices, right? I also then used the warp mode, and specifically the textures warp mode within Simpler to stretch this device. To stretch the sample out a little bit further. And that's kind of what gives it its somewhat otherworldly quality as opposed to it sounding like a guitar, right? If I play this, this doesn't sound anything like that original sample. So in addition to stretching it out, I also transposed it up an octave. If you want to have a kind of a sonic effect where you hear the warp modes doing their job, generally the farther your sample gets from its original state, the more you're going to hear the warp mode. And so even though it's all one chord, I set a number of random breakpoints in slice mode so that each of these samples would be a different key. And then every note that appeared, I plugged it into the MIDI clip here and ran it from the whole length essentially of the 2 or 3 measures I have it here, and then loaded up an arpeggiator that's set to a quarter note rate and set to random, because I didn't want to just hit one slice over and over again. That would be a little boring if I was just like, yeah, right. It's whatever. It gets a little old. So instead, then it's randomly selecting slices, and then finally in the controls section here, I went ahead and set the pan randomness to 100%, which then kind of gives us this overall effect. And is the same exact thing on the A minor chord here. And I absolutely could have, rendered out the two chords as single samples how I wanted to, and then doubled them up into one long audio file and load each of them into their own, or into one simpler. But it helped my brain to have this approach where they were each on their own simpler, in part because then it also allowed me to do some automation with regards to the cutoff from each of them, and this really carries out through pretty much the whole song once it comes in. Okay, let's talk about the vocals now. So I'm doing quite a bit of processing on the vocals. This recording, funny enough, it is labeled guitar on these clips because originally I had the vocal and the guitar recorded at the same time, lazily running through 2 duplicates of the guitar track. This is the vocal that I recorded during the original demo. I was angry and frustrated at the time. And so I just came in here, set up a couple of tracks, grabbed my guitar, hit record, and just started improvising what ultimately became this track. And afterwards, when I went to go whip this demo into an actual song, I intended on re-recording the vocals, but I just could not recapture the qualities of the original that I found compelling. And so I decided to stick with the original vocal and just do whatever work was necessary to get it into the place that I wanted it to. So let's just group all of this together, and then so I can turn it off and we can hear what's happening. So the vocals do have an instance of Waves Tune printed down onto it. If you're unfamiliar with Waves Tune, it is pretty much just like Waves' version of Auto Tune. It gets the job done. I use it because I got it for like $20 once when Waves did one of their 10 million sales. But I find that it's a plugin that's like better to just run and then print and then do additional processing on. So here is the dry vocal. I want to run away. So I also am running it ever so slightly through the instance of large octave shimmer that I have on one of my buses, and more pronounced, I'm running it through an instance of slight slap to create that little slap back delay effect that you're probably hearing on the left and the right ever so slightly. I kind of wanted it to have a little bit of a sense of claustrophobia, and I feel like the slight slap does that. So then as far as the processing that I'm doing on here, I have a compressor that I am running for to catch peaks, because I for lack of a better word, I'm a very dynamic singer, and I will change my dynamics quite quickly. This wasn't recorded as a studio performance, so I'm using a compressor to help with that. And then I am using an instance of M auto pitch to have a more overt auto-tuned sound. I really like M auto pitch. It isn't subtle, and rarely when I add auto-tune do I want it to be subtle. If you're unfamiliar with this plugin, it is completely free. If you search M auto pitch, Melda Productions website will come right up and you can snag it. It's kind of my go-to. So I'm running that into an instance of OTT where I am pulling all the volume out of the low end, because there is no interesting frequencies in my voice in below 80 hertz. So I'm just nixing the gain from that to save space in my mix for my kick and my sub. And then I'm blending it so that we have a little bit of the dry signal also coming through, because OTT does really good at hyping that top end and hyping up some of that low end, but the mid-range can sometimes be robbed as a result. So when I use OTT, 9 times out of 10, I am blending it with the signal that's coming in. And then, yeah, I've just got an instance of EQ8 then afterwards, kind of really cutting everything below 100 hertz, and then just adding a little bit of a boost up around 3K and just a slight dip around 2K. And so let me play the vocal again without all of this stuff on it so we can remember a little bit what the original sound is. I want to run away. And then with this processing. I want to run away. Cool. So you can really kind of hear the subtleties of the M auto pitch of the auto tune. It loves to catch my vibrato, and that's fine. Especially then when we get to some of these phrases that are much higher in my register. I want to run Yeah, you can hear that little bit of artifacting in that last note, and I like that. Then the only other thing that I'm doing with the vocals is I have an instance of Isotope Nectar 3 that is listening to the vocal track and channeling the vocal track into it, that is producing the harmonies. Let me find out where this plugin just went so that I... Okay. Okay, and then the only other plugin that I'm using, and then the only other thing that I'm doing to the vocals is I am running them into a harmony track, and I am creating harmonies using Isotope Nectar 3. I'm a big fan of the harmony engine within Nectar. And so I have a number of different harmonies. There is an octave doubling the octave below that is sitting center farther back, a couple of unisons that are also farther back that are sitting on either side, and then I've got a third and a fifth above, and then pretty high up I have a negative fourth and a negative sixth below. So it's creating this pretty dense chord really every time the vocals are playing, right? So let me play that with the vocal. I want to run away. Really great, right? It sounds nice. Almost sounds like a computerized barbershop. I think it's really quite special when we get to this B section and the vocal lines switch to a completely different melody. I can't take this anymore. I can't take this anymore. So really nice, those big triads. They sound almost like, funny enough, the way that harmony move sounds almost hymn-like to me, which I think lends an interesting quality to the vocal. The final thing that I am doing a bit with the vocals here, I took the vocal, stretched it out to twice its length, using the texture warp mode in Ableton, cranked up the gain size, cranked up the flux, and then just grabbed select words, and I am kind of fading into them, cutting them out, fading out of them, and it is layered in very low, negative 29 decibels, underneath the intro. You would miss them. You likely did if you listened to the song the first time around. They're really subtle. So I'm also running them into 100% wet large shimmer plate hybrid reverb preset, and then running that reverb into an instance of erosion. Let me solo that so you can hear that. So you can hear the really subtle pitch shifting that is coming from the large shimmer plate, right? So let me pull everything else back in the intro, and then we can listen to the intro together, kind of keeping our eyes and our ears out for when that intro vocal comes in. Oh yeah. it just adds some nice vocal texture that I'm a big fan of. And that's really everything then that's happening with the vocals in this track. Okay, let's finish off by talking about some of the ear candy, the extra details, the final 10%. That's always like the hardest aspect of any production, but really helps to make it compelling. So a lot of that can be textural sometimes. And in this case, I am using a field recording that I took of the Seattle light rail when I was headed to PAX West, which is a big gaming convention, and it was just crazy packed that morning. And so I just recorded some of that ambience while I was on the train headed downtown, chopped off a lot of the top end and a lot of the low end, and have kind of just set it a little farther back in the mix. Okay, so my favorite thing that was completely unintentional is the announcement bell of the recording that is used to announce stops is in the same key as this song. I did not plan that. It was just a magical moment of serendipity. I also genuinely did not intentionally time it so that those bells work with the chord changes, but that happened. But I stuck with it once I heard it because it was great. And if I pull the pad in, play that, I couldn't have asked for better luck. But right, if I play those two together, the field recording really adds depth where there might not have been as much if it was just the pad on its own. Right, if I pull out that field recording, we listen to just the pad, we can feel its absence. Now, there is a certain clarity to having just the pad. You can kind of hear the pitch-shifted cicadas in the pad a bit more, but I like having the light rail in. And so this light rail recording really kind of reappears in a couple of different places. When the piano enters, it comes back after the break here. I'll play that transition. So really just hanging out. And then it shows up at the end then as well. When we drop down to just the sustained chord from the piano, I just leave the sustain pedal open and let that run all the way through, and then this comes in. I'm not going to play from all the way here where the sustain chord holds, so we're really just going to hear this light rail outro. And then that keeps going. And so, once again, it adds texture. Humans love the sound of human voices. We are evolutionarily inclined to hear them really above all else. And so just adding subtle elements of that unintelligible chatter from the train is a really nice detail. You might have noticed that the train really swells up here in volume, and this is a good moment to talk about transitions, because I think section transitions are also one of those final little bits of details and ear candy that really help push a track into interesting territory. And so when this piano intro moves into the final chorus, I needed to kind of signal to the listener, like, hey, something big and interesting is coming. So I'm doing a couple of different things. I am swelling up the volume on this field recording here. So this thing that was once very, very background now comes into really sharp focus. And then pulling it out immediately. I then also have that crash that has been pitch shifted downwards, returning. But in this instance, I am also using that Beats warp mode technique to shorten the envelope and create a stutter effect. And then in addition, I am coupling that with an instance of a line delay, which if you're unfamiliar with a line delay, it just lets you detune the left channel from the right channel ever so slightly, and that creates a more enhanced sense of stereo width because it's taking advantage of an aspect of our physiology called interaural time difference, just meaning that our spatial perception is informed by the amount of time it takes a sound from one source to get to one ear versus the other. And the difference is how we understand, is one of the ways we understand space when listening to things. But here I'm kind of abusing it for creative effect. So as this riser swells up, I am widening that image until pretty much the point that we start to really kind of hear it as a delay. Let me play that on its own. Yeah, so we get all the way up to 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second at that point. It sounds, depending on what you're listening on right now, it might sound like it holds together, might sound like it falls apart a little bit, but it creates interest and it keeps the tension going. And that's kind of the number one thing that I see with a lot of my students, is that they are creating a great transition by building tension, but then they let the tension plateau before the transition releases and moves on to the next section. You have to find ways to make sure that the tension keeps moving upwards the entire time the transition is happening. And so I am supporting the shimmery crash here with the volume boost on this light rail recording. So if I play from here, right, pulls it up, and then I cut everything out except for this chunk of piano, which the piano then jumps up an octave, and I change the processing on it. So it calls attention to that moment to say, okay, we're doing something different here with the piano. Have you tuned out? You should be listening again. If not, let me play everything together so you can get a sense for that. And then we're back into that final chorus. The string quartet is in, and hopefully if the listener's engagement was waning a little bit, we pulled them back in with this. And so think about ear candy, think about transitions when you're working on your own productions. It is usually the final 10%, and it is like pulling teeth. But it's so critical and so necessary to having the kind of sounds that you want in your production. At least I think so anyway. Thank you for watching. Run is available to stream everywhere. It would mean a lot to me if you added it to your playlists and into your daily rotation. And you can check out the music video, as I mentioned before, on this channel in the description below. If you want to keep up with what I am doing in the day-to-day and the week-to-week, consider subscribing to my newsletter, Keep Living with Music. It is where I talk about my life as a full-time composer, music producer, and teaching artist. And as always, please like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you next time.